Welcome back to AP World History Modern Test Prep for Unit 4. In this video, we're going to take a couple of weeks of class and sum them up into one not too long review video. Thanks for hanging with me and investing those minutes into your own success. You, my friend, are awesome. So let's waste no time and jump right into Unit 4. Now, this unit is often referred to as Maritime Empires, or as the College Board calls it, transoceanic interconnections. And in many ways, we'll contrast all those land-based empires from Unit 3. Remember, this unit is concurrent with the last one, with the land-based empires like Ottoman, Mughal, Ming, Songhai, all developing at the same time that exploration is happening. 1492 is kind of being in that time frame and clues us into the idea that this is the period when exploration is happening. Because 1492 is when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, the last video talked about land-based empires and had some easy, clear themes. There was just a lot of them. This unit is going to have far less empires, but a lot of themes. We will spend some significant time exploring causes and effects of historical developments, as well as other historical thinking skills like change and continuity. What changes during this time period and what stays consistent over time. Just as we had talked about in the other videos, contextualization helps us understand how we got here. It's more than just background about a topic in the prompt, let's say. It's zooming out to understand a bigger picture of what's happening historically. And even in this case, traveling back in time. Not like time travel, but essentially looking at the timeline and what happened before that caused what's happening now. For context, absolutely look at the time period or the unit prior to the prompt, and that usually will clue you in on what you should look at. Now, I like most Marvel movies, and I apologize for all the references, but it's really tricky to understand Endgame without understanding the snap. How did we get here? Now, it's more than a backstory. It's not simply explaining the background of Thanos and what happened in Infinity War. It's a broader look at history that's relevant to understanding the snap. When you do DBQs or LEQs and you start out your essay, you really want to start with contextualization, not simply giving the background information of the topic that's listed in the prompt, but really zoom out and what historical processes and developments got you there. For Endgame, you'd want to be thinking of things like the time period, the Infinity Stones, maybe the quantum realm, other key characters along the way, not just Thanos and the snap. How did we get here? Now, the very first thing we need to do to understand how we even got to the point of Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492 is we need to look at context. If you had a DBQ or LEQ about Columbus or exploration, you would not get the contextualization point if you simply told the children's book story of Columbus going to Ferdinand and Isabella. No, you need to zoom out and tell the bigger story of exploration. Go back a unit to fully understand how we got here. Now, the cross-cultural interactions that get traced back to Columbus resulted from one major development or process that happened prior. And that, my friends, is the spread of technology and the diffusion of it. Without the spread of technology, Christopher Columbus would be sailing nowhere and maybe just be living in Italy, eating salami, and maybe a pizza that doesn't have tomato sauce. So let's zoom out and look at the timeline of history to explain the spread of technology. Now, the Crusades introduced Europe to classical thinking and advanced medical knowledge in the Islamic world, while gunpowder spread throughout the Silk Roads due to the Mongols, along with other significant Chinese inventions like paper or the compass. Europeans now had access to all of this knowledge, and out of it birthed some major things. Obviously the Renaissance, but that will also then lead to the scientific revolution. Out of the scientific revolution birthed new ideas. Copernicus developed a theory based on math, not my favorite subject, that the Earth revolved around the sun, and the Earth rotated on an axis. This is known as the heliocentric theory. People were totally skeptical and still believed in Aristotle's theory from a long time ago that the Earth was in fact the center of the universe. Later, Galileo developed a telescope and saw Jupiter and further supported Copernicus's theories. The Catholic Church totally resisted these new theories, so much so that Galileo was put on trial for heresy. That word frequently comes up in AP World passages, so I would know what it means. It's basically when someone believes something that's contrary to Christian teachings, or a synonym of heresy is false teachings. Galileo was forced to recant, and the Catholic Church banned all of his writings. All of this to say that technology and learning was happening in Europe, and these technological advancements were used for the purpose of exploration. Now, any of these technological advancements and items would be good to mention, as they had direct impacts on exploration, and later, empire building. Number 1, the compass. Developed back in the Han Dynasty by the Chinese, it spread to the Arab world and eventually will spread back to Europeans. Number 2, the astrolabe. I'm not really going to explain exactly how an astrolabe works. There's lots of math and science involved here, but basically it involves measuring the distance of the sun from the stars or the horizon, and it determines your latitude. Lateen sails. It's a triangular sail that was used on ships like the caravel and the carrack, which allowed them to sail in any direction regardless of which way the wind was blowing. Number 4, voto do mar, the understanding of the current winds and where they could catch the currents by traveling further distances and then letting the current push them in. Think of it kind of like driving on the highway. It may be more miles to get somewhere, but you get there faster than driving direct, but maybe through the city. Cartography, the study and development of better maps, was huge. Gunpowder, again developed in China, spread to the Arab world, used greatly by the Ottomans, we learned in the last unit, but this will eventually then come to Europe, and guns will be used by explorers. These weapons, unfortunately, will give them a serious military advantage. Now, there are 5 major states in Europe that we are going to focus on in this video, as they are the major states in the exploration race: Portugal, Spain, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. Who will be the ultimate winner? We shall see as different states lead at different moments of the race. It's a lot like a brat race. Wait, what? You don't know what that is? You don't know what a brat is? Oh, Wisconsin culture here. You know, a brat is like a sausage. In this case, like the sausage race at Miller Park. No? You don't know what Miller Park is? America's pastime? Baseball? All right, so a little bit of a background. Miller Park is where the Milwaukee Brewers play baseball. Every home game, there is a race. And today, there are 5 racing sausages: brat, Polish, Italian, hot dog, and chorizo. And just like the sausage race, some of them get ahead early on and then later fall behind and someone else comes ahead. Just because Italian maybe led the race, there's a good chance that they may drop behind and chorizo can come out of nowhere and win the race. Now we're going to talk about the Big 5 empires, much like this. Our Big 5 will start by sponsoring explorers so they can arrive at foreign destinations much faster and avoid the land-based empires like the Ottoman and the Safavid and the Mughal, who would tax them all throughout the way. Portugal's royal family, they're going to start the race super strong, as they're trying to get to the Indian Ocean for all of those spices. They will sponsor Bartholomew Diaz, who will get to the tip of Africa, known as the Cape of Good Hope. In 1497, then, they'll sponsor another explorer, Vasco da Gama, who will get to the Cape of Good Hope and then get all the way to India. Portugal starts out this race leading for sure. Then Spain had recently unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, and they too joined the race. In 1492, they were approached by Christopher Columbus with this crazy idea that he would get to the east, or the Indian Ocean Spice Network, by sailing to the west. We know this story as we find out that his calculations were slightly off, and he discovered instead the Americas. He technically lands in Cuba and the islands in the Caribbean. It became known as the West Indies, and that's where the term Indian came from, which is because he thought he was in India, but he was neither in India nor the Indian Ocean Network. Spain then sent other explorers to explore other areas of the Americas, like Vespucci, De Leon, and Vasco de Balboa. And we'll look at that in a little bit. Now, far behind in the exploration race would be France, England, and the Netherlands. They had sponsored other explorers, like England will sponsor John Cabot, and he'll explore North America. Henry Hudson was sponsored by the Dutch, and he will look for a northwest passage to Asia, but he'll really just be in the Hudson River by New York. Now, let's break down the causes for all of this activity and this race in the first place. Most obviously, explorers wanted access to the spices found in the Indian Ocean, and they were looking for a shortcut to get there. If those spices came over land, they would be taxed throughout the Islamic world. Mughal, Safavid, Ottomans. They all stood between the Europeans and that trade network. Plus, you simply can carry more on ships than you can when traveling over land. Now, there's a famous phrase that really makes the causes of exploration super easy to remember. God, gold, glory. It's a phrase used to describe the motives that led for overseas exploration, expansion, and eventual conquest by European countries during this period. So let's start with God. This gets at the idea that the spread of the Christian faith was very important, most specifically to the Catholic Church when we're looking at the Americas. Now, this is partly due to the rivalry with the expanding Islamic empires. Cause number 2, gold. This does not just mean that they really wanted literal gold, although that was important too, but it really encompasses all material gain. They really wanted to find spices, but usually they didn't just want spices, they wanted the wealth that came from buying and selling any goods outside of Europe. And 3 is glory. Glory means more than just I'm awesome, but really they wanted to support their home country and the rivalries we see between the big monarchies in Europe at this time. So God, gold, glory. So after Columbus discovers the Americas, we enter one of those major turning points in history where nothing is the same after. The continents of the Americas are for the first time interconnected. So we see the old world, being Europe, Asia, and Africa, connected to the new world, referring to the Americas, both North and South America. It is worth saying that the new world was really only new to those who were not from there. If you were in the Americas, you would think the Europeans were new, but I digress. Who writes the history? Now, the interconnection between the Old World and the New World was directly linked to Columbus's voyages and the discovery of the Americas, despite his real desire just to get to the Indies. This major historical development brought a floodgate of effects and consequences, known as the Columbian Exchange, named after Columbus. Now, the first major goods that were exchanged were food and animals. From the Americas, Europeans experienced food they had never experienced before. Potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, avocados, corn, beans. They seriously had been missing out. And they will bring these foods back and were able to even grow them in Europe. Europeans also brought food over to the Americas. And over time, things like coffee and sugar and grapes, bananas, citrus. Now, the real diet-changing part of the exchange would be the animals that were brought to the Americas. The only domesticated animals in the Americas at this time were the alpaca and the turkey. However, Europeans brought cows and pigs and horses and chickens. The pigs were especially helpful because they breed really quickly, and that expanded the food supply in the Americas. Horses and oxen helped bring more land under cultivation, plus grains like wheat, rice, barley, oats, all came to the Americas as well and were farmed and grown there. Now, it's amazing to think that foods that we think are iconic Italian foods, like spaghetti or pizza, they really wouldn't even be possible without old world foods like tomato. Also, when I go out to eat at our favorite Mexican restaurant in town and I order carne asada tacos with cilantro and onion on corn tortillas, well, they weren't possible either because the steak and the onion part, not possible without the Columbian Exchange. And let's just set the record straight while we're on it. Tacos, real tacos, do not have cheese on them. Fight me. Comments. And now, as we've said before, more food equals more population, and this will bring an increase to population globally. But the Columbian Exchange will also bring disease to the New World, as they had no immunity to those old world diseases that old world people had developed over thousands of years. people in the Americas never lived closely to domesticated animals, and many diseases come from contact with these animals. Smallpox, measles, malaria, chickenpox, yellow fever were among these deadly diseases which were transmitted to the New World, the most deadly being smallpox. Now, the smallpox epidemics caused the largest death tolls among indigenous Americans, killing more people than any war to this point, and the Black Death. Now, the Columbian Exchange will exchange goods and animals and diseases, which will cause a massive population loss maybe in the short term for Americans. However, in the long term will increase population, as we said before. Initially, though, this will be in the Old World, Africa, Europe, and Asia. Europeans also established new cash crop industries in the New World. Sugar and tobacco and cotton were successfully grown in the American climates. This will also bring the negative reality of forced labor from the indigenous Americans. However, with the spread of disease and population shortages will also then lead to the even more tragic idea of the Atlantic slave trade. The next two themes we are going to look at and investigate are the same from the last unit. How did states build and expand their various empires from 1450 to 1750? And then how did they maintain their rule over those empires? The empires we're going to be looking at are the big 5 maritime empires that we talked about before: Portugal, Spain, Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands. Spain will be the leader in American conquest and will achieve a far lead from the other 4 countries. Spain explored the regions of Central and South America. Conquistadors were explorers and conquerors, as it translates to. The most famous would be Hernan Cortez, who will conquer the Aztec Empire in modern-day Mexico. And Francisco Pizarro in Peru will conquer the vast Incan Empire. Using Jared Diamond's famous argument, they were able to do this because of guns, germs, and steel. Due to their domestication of animals and agriculture thousands of years prior, agriculturalists from the Old World allowed for specialization of labor, and because of that, they were able to develop new technologies like metallurgy and gunpowder. Europeans were able to access and build on these technologies more recently, so they had stronger weapons and swords, which made them have steel and guns. And this gunpowder that came made them pretty successful. Meanwhile, the people in the Americas did not have these technologies, which allowed a small number of Europeans to devastate an existing gigantic empire, both from the Incas and the Aztecs. This is how they established their maritime empire. Spain will utilize the viceroyalty system, which was a political bureaucratic institution created by the Spanish monarchy in the 15th century for ruling its overseas colonies. They were going to establish 4 viceroyalties, the most famous being the Viceroyalty of New Spain in Mexico, established in 1521 by Cortez, and the Viceroyalty in Peru in 1534 by Pizarro. The other 2 would be in other areas of South America, and strangely enough even, the Viceroyalty in Mexico would also govern their colonies in the Caribbean and the Philippines across the Pacific, which was established as a colony in 1565. The viceroyalty system was how the Spanish maintained control once it was established. Now, each viceroyalty was governed by a viceroy, or a governor, who would report back to the Spanish monarch back in Spain. Viceroys aided in the converting of native populations to Christianity, most namely Roman Catholicism, and oversaw an economy based on almost entirely mining and ranching. Audiencias were other parts of their bureaucratic system that oversaw administering justice through being a judge or a lawyer, and people could voice their concerns or go to the court with these audiencias. You'll notice that large governments, yet again, maintain control through a bureaucracy, very similar to what we saw in the land-based empires. Unfortunately, if we were to trace the route back to why Spain established the viceroyalty in the very first place, it probably goes back to those ideas of God, gold, and glory. And that's true here. While missionaries did follow the conquistadors, Spain was interested in building the wealth hub of the crown, and they did this through coerced or forced labor. The first system was known as the encomienda. A Spanish encomendero, or a landowner, was given a number of native laborers who would pay tribute to him in exchange for his protection. Because if you were from that region and the Spanish just took your home, you would totally want them to protect you? Europeans. Plus, these protectors were actually perpetrators of violence and quite terrible people. You can read many primary sources about how terrible the Spanish treated the natives. Bartholomew de las Casas was a key whistleblower. He was a Catholic missionary, for real, and he was specifically a Dominican friar who was in the Americas and saw firsthand how the people were treated in the encomienda system. Here is a section of one of his writings. He says this: New Spain, Mexico, was discovered in 1517, and at the time, great atrocities were committed against the indigenous people of the region, and some were killed by members of the expedition. In 1518, the so-called Christians set about stealing from the people and murdering them on the pretense of settling the area. If we were to do some good old analysis here of this document, I would probably do point of view or purpose. If you recall from the last video, I like to use this sentence frame for point of view. As a blank, insert your lens or point of view here, comma, the author believes blank. In his case, I would say this. As a Catholic missionary who is in New Spain, de las Casas' beliefs against the encomienda system was shaped by his personal faith. He called the Spanish encomenderos, quote, so-called Christians, to point out the hypocrisy between their beliefs and their actions. That could be point of view. Purpose would be another way to analyze this document. Why was de las Casas writing this? I'll tell you what won't count for credit in a DBQ. Saying that he was writing this document to inform people about what was happening in the Americas won't cut it. You also can't just write that the purpose was to tell people about great atrocities. De las Casas wasn't a historian. His purpose was for something to happen and for the injustices to stop. You would need to write how he saw the encomienda system as broken. It was under a false pretense. People didn't want to protect natives. They wanted to settle the area. And the so-called Christians were using the encomienda system as a smokescreen for what was really happening. De las Casas wanted to be a whistleblower. He wanted to be the person that called out these false pretenses so that the killings and the abuses would ultimately stop. If I see something terrible happening, I don't write about it so people could just know about it. I write about it so people could stop doing the bad thing. Purpose requires you to dig into what's not being said in the source. Now, eventually change will occur because the Spanish crown sees how terrible the native people are being treated, and they replace it with the repartimento system. This will be a major change in economic and labor systems in the Americas. The repartimento system no longer gave settlers land and natives to work it, but rather allotted natives to work for several weeks and retain some sort of freedom. The goal was to eliminate the abuses. However, by this time, the amount of natives had decreased significantly due to the Columbian Exchange, namely the smallpox, which then will give rise to the Atlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans will be captured and sold along West and Central Africa, and they would be subjected to horrific treatment through the Middle Passage and then later as slave laborers, mostly on agricultural plantations, but also in mining. The legacies and the long-term effects of this decision are too numerous even to tackle in this video, as racism unfortunately is still alive today. But at the very least, you could easily argue that a continuity, or something that stays the same during this time period, would be the continued use of forced labor. First the encomienda, then the repartimento, and then the unfortunate African slave trade. By far, of the big five empires, the Spanish Empire would be the one you probably learned about the most. And you probably also remember that the Spanish found silver in mountains in both Mexico and Peru, areas like Potosi. These silver mines pushed Spain even further into the lead in the Maritime Empire race. In fact, they had so much silver that they were going on a huge spending spree for Chinese goods. Silver will flood into the Ming Dynasty as people bought silk and porcelain, and the Ming didn't really regulate the influx of silver and had inflation issues of their own, which will lead the Ming to be more isolated in international commerce in the future. And the same was true of the Tokugawa shogunate, if you recall that from the last video. Now, as the Portuguese and the Spanish were the early leaders in the Maritime Empires race, they will reach an agreement, which is called the Treaty of Tordesillas, to clear up some land disputes that were kind of happening. And then they knew who would have what land. It was a north-south line that gave to Spain everything to the west, and to Portugal everything in the east. This gave the power to Portugal to settle easternmost parts of South America, or what will become modern-day Brazil. It is why Brazilians today speak Portuguese. And unfortunately, they're going to be really brutal in their colonial regime, based around the sugar industry. With Brazil as the exception, the Portuguese were mostly just concerned with trade, more than colonization, and they will continue to set up trading posts along the African coast. Remember how the Portuguese established a trading relationship with Congo and King Alfonso I, who then even converted to Christianity? They later also will have a relationship with Ndongo, and you remember how Ana Zinga sat face to face and negotiated with them? Well, it's yet another trading partner with them that the Portuguese had, especially so that they could acquire African slaves. Now they have a falling out with Nzinga, and then a new state, Matamba, comes out of this so that they would be out of reach of the Portuguese. But at the end of the day, the real goal of the Portuguese was to make the monarch back home more powerful and increase their riches. Now, trailing behind in this great race we've been talking about would be the monarchs of Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands. They explored mostly North America, and their goal was still to find an alternative route to Asia. Remember, everyone still wanted those spices and the goods in the Indian Ocean. This will lead Great Britain to establish the 13 American colonies. If you're from the States, you've learned this story before, and we will circle back to it during Unit 5 for revolutions. They will also have the British East India Company that establishes Indian Ocean trade. But again, we're going to come back to that later. Now, the French are going to establish New France, some really original names we have here, where they're going to set up forts and trading posts in Canada. Areas like Quebec and Montreal, as well as modern U.S. cities like Detroit and Green Bay, and down the Mississippi and into Louisiana. They will have a much better relationship with Native Americans compared to pretty much everyone. Why? Well, they respected Native beliefs, they didn't take large parts of their land, and they simply worked alongside of them in a mutually beneficial relationship. Now, the French are going to bring European goods that they're going to trade with the native people for furs. Now, they were still out to make money and sometimes allied with other native tribes over others, but it looks significantly different from the Spanish and the English. Now, the Netherlands also established maritime empires. They established New Amsterdam in North America around modern-day New York City, as they were following the Hudson River to find a way to Asia. We know that will not get you there. It'll get you kind of to the Great Lakes in the Midwest once the Erie Canal is built, but nowhere near Asia. The Dutch will then establish some colonies in the Caribbean, near the Cape Colony in South Africa, and in the Indian Ocean. The Dutch East India Company was chartered by the monarch in the Netherlands. It was a joint stock company where merchants pooled their resources to share the risk and later the reward. Investors would buy shares or stock in the company, and if there was a profit, they would then share the profits. The Netherlands controlled routes to the Spice Islands, specifically around modern-day Indonesia. The major competitor to the Dutch would be the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. Overall, the goal of the Big Five was to accumulate capital, or money, in this new commercial revolution. The theory that governed all of this was mercantilism, or as some say, mercantilism. It was guided by the belief that there was a fixed amount of wealth in the world and that they had to get as much of it as possible. This meant that a mother country would attempt to have a favorable balance of trade. They would have more exports and less imports. and ultimately gain as much gold or silver in their national treasury or bank. This led countries to colonize other places, and these colonies would give the mother country raw resources, which wouldn't be considered imports because they were part of the mother country. They would then process these goods and sell them as exports, oftentimes back to the colonies which provided the raw resources. This will bring some resentment and, spoiler, lead to revolutions in the future. If I was to point out a continuity and change in networks, I would say that the biggest change would obviously be the emergence of the Atlantic Trading Network with the Americas and with the Old World, and also a decline in overland routes. A continuity regarding trade would be the persistent desire for Indian Ocean trade goods, as rivalries also continued between European states for who was the greatest and who was leading our race. Another theme we need to look at during Unit 4 is how all of this colonization impacted those social structures and religious beliefs. Once Spain had established their viceroyalties, more Spaniards, mostly men, moved to the colonies, which created a very distinct social hierarchy. At the top of the social order were peninsulares, or people who were born on the Iberian Peninsula, and they came to the colonies as government officials. Creoles were people who were born in the colonies, but to Spanish parents. They were 100% European, but only knew of life in the colonies. That was home. They couldn't get those top positions, but were highly educated and wealthy. Below the Creoles were mestizos, those that had both European and Native American ancestry. Below them on the social ladder were mulattoes, those who had European and African ancestry. Finally, Native Americans had less rights and enslaved Africans below that. This reality led to the casta system, which was a system of racial classifications, where a person was really, by the system, dictated their social status, how much they could get taxed, and their legal rights. This was yet another way the Spanish maintained power within their empire. People throughout time have always legitimized their rule also through religion, and that was no exception in the Americas. In Central and South America, due to the Spanish and the Portuguese efforts, Roman Catholicism was the major religion that was spread to this region, and it led to the conversion of many indigenous peoples. It also led to syncretic beliefs, where Old World and New World beliefs would kind of blend together with beliefs like Santeria and Vodun. Both Santeria and Vodun, or Voodoo, blended West African beliefs with Catholicism. Protestant beliefs were mostly spread in North America with the British and the Dutch, whereas the French will also spread Roman Catholicism. Now, Unit 4 has a lot of changes that occurred. Remember that if you are ever asked to discuss changes, you must mention what things were like prior and then what things changed too. Obviously, the biggest change would be that the Americas were once really isolated on the global scene to being truly interconnected, especially with their economies. We also see that the former American empires like the Aztec and the Inca fall to the Spanish, which will establish large maritime empires in the Americas. Another change would be the Columbian Exchange, as goods that were never seen before were being poured into the Old World and to the New World. New social orders emerged. New labor systems emerged. The list really could go on. There's a lot of changes. There were also still some continuities that you could argue about this whole time period as a whole. Remember that continuities are processes that continue or stay the same. Merchants still desired the Indian Ocean and Asian goods and sought for faster and quicker ways to get to that network. Muslim merchants continue to travel the trade routes as they had done during past centuries. And during this time, Muslim merchants established themselves further in North Africa and the Indian Ocean, which is why Islam is a dominant religion still in those regions. Coerced or forced labor systems continued despite some changes over that time. Social hierarchies also continue to deny rights to various groups, like women and minority groups. And lastly, leaders from all over the world continue to legitimize their rule through the use of religious beliefs. The Spanish believed that missionary endeavors in the Americas and the idea of divine right. The Ming held on to the idea of the mandate of heaven. Mughals and Ottomans pointed back to Muhammad for their claim at their legitimacy. Now, the world changed radically during the period of 1450 to 1750, and for many people, their rights were denied or challenged. We will see that few stood without a fight. But really, advanced technology gave some people just the upper hand. And as we travel into the next period, we will see that new movements will lead to revolutions and further will change the world. Now, check out the description below in the Quizlet deck and take some time to review all of the terms from this unit. Thanks again for watching up until the end. Be sure to check out the rest of the unit review videos to prep for your AP tests. Watch them one more time before you go in. Hit the subscribe button below, stay up to date with all the test prep videos, and stay tuned for next time as we look at Unit 5, Revolutions.